I want to focus a little bit on Australia's example because I think it's instructive to this House. Australia had policies to lock up refugee claimants long-term and deny them permanent status, even when granted refugee status, in an attempt to stop refugees coming to that country by boat. Exactly what's happening here. The policies resulted in refugees, including many children, being traumatized by their experiences in detention. The Australian Human Rights Commission, an organisation created by the Australian Parliament, conducted a national inquiry into children in immigration detention and found that children in Australian immigration detention centres had suffered numerous and repeated breaches of their human rights. Far from deterring people, depriving refugees of the right to family reunification appears to have caused some people to arrive by boat, as later boats brought the wives and children of refugees in Australia unable to bring their families through legal channels. And of course, this was a deeply divisive policy, with many people in Australia unclear about what the best approach was. But what we do know is in the past 3 years, Australia has moved away from the policies of detention and temporary status for refugees. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to chat a little bit about history because, of course, there's the old adage that those of us that forget history are doomed to repeat it. Canada's history with respect to migration and refugees is not perfect. The Chinese head tax and the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War are both relics of an old, discredited philosophies and sadly of our past. Another event from our undistinguished past was the Canadian government's refusal to admit a boatload of Jewish people fleeing Hitler's Germany, a refusal that forced the MS St. Louis back to Europe, where many of the passengers perished in the Holocaust. The individuals on that boat were not Canadian citizens or even permanent residents. Yet many Canadians feel, and the Minister of Immigration himself has expressed, a sense of responsibility for the passengers on the St. Louis and a fundamental ethical obligation to help people in desperate situations flee for their lives. In the Minister's words, at the unveiling of the monument to commemorate the MS St. Louis just this year, it was described, and he described the monument as a concrete, perpetual expression of regret. The Minister went on to remind us that we must learn from the lessons of history in order to apply them in the future, and said this: Canada will never close its doors to legitimate refugees who need our protection and who are fleeing persecution. Mr. Speaker, the official opposition agrees with that sentiment, and it's precisely for that reason that we will profoundly oppose this bill unless the many, many problems with this bill are not cleared. History will otherwise continue to judge Canada on the way in which we treat victims of international crisis. Now again, a bill that creates two tiers of refugees, a bill that violates our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a bill that violates Canada's obligations under international law. And if I may, I'd like to read a section from the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees which Canada has signed. Article 31.1 says this: contracting states shall not impose penalties on account of their illegal entry or presence on refugees who, coming directly from a territory where their life or freedom was threatened in the sense of Article 1, enter or are present in their territory without authorization, providing that they present themselves without delay to the authorities and show good cause for their illegal entry or presence. Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what this bill does, is violate that section, because it's imposing penalties on account of people's illegal entry or presence on refugees who are directly fleeing persecution. Mr. Speaker, last summer and the summer before, we saw 2 boats come to this country containing refugees fleeing what is agreed by every state in this world to be a terrible civil war in Sri Lanka. There were approximately 478 people on one boat. There were approximately 80 on another boat. And these were people who risked their lives to come to a country where they could be safe. I would ask all Canadians what they would do if the country in which they found themselves threatened their lives of their husbands or wives and their children. If armed people were coming to get them and draft their children into child armies. If armed thugs were coming to sexually assault wives and young girls or young boys. If armed men were coming to kill you, what would you do? I dare say that every Canadian would answer that question the same way. They would do whatever they had to do in order to save the lives of their loved ones and to escape to safety. And even that may include paying someone. You know, that's another big problem of this bill, is it confuses human smuggling, criminal organizations engaged in inappropriate criminal acts, with the irregular movement of refugees, often which involves the payment of money in order to have an organized, subversive way to escape a country. I also want to spend one moment talking about this nonsense of a queue. There is no queue when it comes to refugees, and this government should be ashamed of itself for going out in the public and confusing Canadians that these are queue jumpers. There's two ways refugees come to this country. One is under the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. They're in refugee camps. They're safe and they can make orderly applications. The second way is refugees directly fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution. Imagine fleeing a war zone. Those people can't stop and make an application. Those people don't present themselves to the nearest authorities and queue up. Can you imagine the Jewish people in Nazi Germany showing up at German authorities and say, we want to make an application and claim refugee status? That's absurd. And the law and international law recognizes that, Mr. Speaker. So this idea that refugees are coming here and somehow jumping in front of anybody else is absolutely false. And once again, anybody who is trying to muddy the waters for political purposes by confusing those two concepts ought to be ashamed of themselves. Because at its fundamental base, Mr. Speaker, that's because Canada has an obligation. We have signed treaties to be a mature country on the world stage, and we have agreed to accept our obligations. And one of those is to do our fair share to accept refugees. The definition of a refugee, Mr. Speaker, is clear. That person must show our country that they have a well-founded fear of persecution. By definition, we're talking about a profoundly serious situation where someone risks death, injury, torture, or some unacceptable conduct or treatment that violates the common norms of civilized society. Those people need our help. Canada needs to have fair rules to adjudicate such claims. Canadians, of course, don't agree with human smuggling. Of course, we want to do our fair share to make sure that criminal organizations that are trafficking in people or who are involved in the international sex trade are punished and stopped. Those are criminals. That is very different from refugees fleeing persecution and the whole network that has surrounded that activity of people who help them. This act criminalizes the whole process. It even criminalizes those people who help refugees. Church groups, faith groups, refugee organizations all risk being deemed to be in violation of this act and deemed criminals because they help and assist refugees. Mr. Speaker, that has to be misguided. That has to be wrong. That has to be bad legislation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I just want to conclude by saying that under this government, since 2006, there has been a concerted drop in the number of family class visas that have been issued by this government. There has been a dramatic drop in the number of refugee visas issued by this government. And this is not New Democrat official opposition numbers. These are numbers published by the Citizenship and Immigration Canada website that just came out in June. This government needs to restore Canada's reputation on the world stage by not only treating the refugee claims to come to this country, but improving our system so that we allow more refugees to get to Canada and be settled. And so that we let more refugees who are those millions of people who are in refugee camps and in dangerous situations all over the world get to places of safe haven and safety. I have seen every member, or members of this House from every party, show up at commemorations of the Komagata Maru or at the St. Louis, as I just pointed out. And we all bow our heads and remember those days when Canada sent away boatloads of people who came to our shores seeking freedom and safety, only decades later to find out that we were sending those people back to their death. Mr. Speaker, Canada deserves fair and balanced refugee legislation. This legislation is not fair and balanced, and the official opposition will work hard to amend this until it is, or defeat it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.